Okay, thanks very much, Mark, for inviting me, and Dan and Michael also, whom I met last week, or a couple weeks ago, when I gave another talk in Taichung. It's great to be here, and it's great to drive out from here, from Taichung, where the further you drive, the fewer motorcycles there are, the less noise, the more clean air. You're lucky to have this kind of environment so close to Taichung, and we're lucky to be here today. I wanted to mostly talk about what it's like to be a diplomat and perhaps encourage some of you to be diplomats. Of course, I've been an American diplomat, and I know a lot of you here are not from the United States in terms of citizenship, but every country has diplomats. Even Taiwan, which is an unusual country right now, has its own diplomats. They may use a different name, but they do the same thing that other diplomats do. This is, again, from the American point of view, but most other diplomatic services are similar, although each will have its own rules. In the United States, it's really easy, in one sense, to be a U.S. diplomat. All you have to do is pass a test. Now, you all have taken tests here at school. You're probably very good at taking tests and passing tests. That's all you need to do also to get in the Foreign Service. You don't have to have any kind of degree. On occasion, we have people in the Foreign Service who didn't graduate from high school, for example. Mostly, the people who pass the test tend to be ones who do have degrees. And in fact, most of them are older than you. They're about 30 years old when they get in. They may have taken the test earlier. But you can take the test as early as age 20. And I think some of you are getting close to age 20. And in a couple of years, you can take it. You have to be 21 in order to be sworn in as a Foreign Service officer, but you can take the test at age 20. And that's the only qualification that's needed. You know, there are some countries where you do have to have some degrees, or you have to know someone, you have to get a recommendation. It's maybe more complicated, but the U.S. is quite simple. And once you pass it, if you're in the U.S., you get called to Washington, D.C., along with a bunch of other people who passed the test, maybe 40 or 50. There were about 50 when I was doing it. And you get about 6 weeks of orientation. Sort of meetings like this where people come in and talk to you and tell you what's going on in U.S. diplomacy and what's going on in the U.S. government. And you're sort of excited, but you're more excited to know where you're going. And where you're going is anywhere in the world. When you become a U.S. diplomat, and probably the same with other countries, you have to agree to worldwide service. You have to agree to go anywhere in the world on behalf of your government. Now, you may actually inside think, well, I really don't want to go certain places. If you're American, maybe you're a little scared of going to Afghanistan, for example. But those are the rules. If you want to be a diplomat, countries have embassies all around the world, and they have to be staffed. There are also embassies in nice places like Paris, where I was stationed also. Well, let me make a quick introduction. This is my wife, Lydia, sitting in the front row, by the way. And I should say, although I was a U.S. diplomat, there are lots of international organizations and other international parts of the U.S. government that you can consider working at. You know, the Peace Corps you know about, the Department of Commerce you know about, the CIA, everybody knows about the CIA. If you're interested in those, you can look at their websites. There are international organizations too, such as the United Nations and your MUN program. How many of you are participating in MUN, by the way? Ooh, a lot. Okay, great. I've looked over your materials. They're wonderful materials. And my compliments to those who wrote them. There's no better preparation for being a diplomat than looking at those issues that are set out in the materials. They're all important issues that the U.S. is looking at today in terms of foreign policy in other countries too. So you're on the right track. Part of being a diplomat is diversity. As I suggested, you could be assigned anywhere in the world, although mostly you're in charge of your own assignments. You can make your preferences known, and of course they look on the other side, who else wants to go there, what's the competition, and eventually assignments are made. They could be anywhere in the world. Everyone has his or her own path as a diplomat. I'm going to tell you something about the path that I was on, mostly chosen by me, with authorization from the State Department, and all my colleagues had their own paths, and not a single one is identical, nor is mine, but we're all the same in that we're all different. You see my point. There's a hardship rule. Not everybody can go to Paris all the time. After about 8 years, there's a computer that sort of triggers and identifies your name and says, Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so has been stationed at very easy post. It's time for a hardship post. A hardship could be a place that's dangerous. It could be a place that's unhealthy, a place that's polluted, a place that's all three of those. Something like 60% of the posts overseas are classified as hardship posts by the United States. There are time limits for each assignment, usually about 3 years, and then you move on somewhere else. Why do they have those time limits? Well, because they discover that if you stay more than about 3 years, instead of representing your country overseas, you start representing the other country. You start thinking like they do, which is fine to some extent. You're supposed to know how people in another country think, but you don't want to sort of take over their viewpoint. The State Department, U.S. State Department has language training in every language that's used in diplomacy, like about 75 different languages. As I say, diversity of locations overseas, you also typically spend about 25% of your time in the United States if you're an American diplomat, or in your home country if you're other countries' diplomats. Every job has a kind of a grade. Just like you, if you're a certain age, you're probably in the 5th grade. If you've passed the 4th grade, other qualifications. Some people come in the Foreign Service and they'll say, I want to be an ambassador. Well, it's a little early. You have to sort of write down jobs that you're qualified for, that are your rank, and you have the right language qualifications, you have the right health conditions. Some posts are unhealthy and people with certain physical makeup can't go there. There's no medical supplies for them there. There's a question of family matters too. They look into whether there are educational opportunities for your children there, maybe employment opportunities, perhaps job opportunities for a spouse. At the same time, one of the downsides of being a diplomat is you're going to be away a lot from your relatives, your parents, your children's grandparents. There's going to be separation compared with staying in your home country all of your life. What happens after you get there, if you're an American diplomat, they're going to ask you to support U.S. foreign policy, whether you personally believe in it or not. It makes sense, right? If you don't support these goals, why go to work for the U.S. government? And those are the goals, rather simply, security, anti-terrorism, you might say, wars against terrorism, prosperity, finding jobs overseas for Americans, trading with other countries, investment opportunities, going both ways, liberty and international cooperation. These last two are perhaps more uniquely goals of U.S. foreign policy. If you look at some countries, they don't care about liberty in other countries. They'll say it's none of our business what goes on in other countries. We just want to handle our own people, and U.S. should stay out of our affairs, for example. International cooperation. Under the Bush administration, President Bush had the reputation of being a sort of a cowboy who was going to go it alone. He said, you're either with us or against us. President Obama has emphasized more international cooperation, use of United Nations more, joining, particularly with Southeast Asia, going to Southeast Asia ASEAN meetings, far more than the Bush administration did. I'll say a few words about my assignments in the Foreign Service. Again, I'm typical in that I'm not typical. Every assignment, every officer has his own pathway. My very first assignment, I was right down the hall from the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, just for a year. I came in just as U.S. was being criticized because we supported a lot of dictatorships around the world. The Shah of Iran, for example. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. I understand we have some Filipino students here. We supported them. Why did we support them? Anyone? Because there was a Cold War going on, and the U.S. felt threatened by the Soviet Union, and essentially we were willing to support any country or government that opposed the Soviet Union or was not going to be friendly with the Soviet Union, even if they were engaged in human rights abuses against their own people. Well, some people in the United States felt awkward about that, said we shouldn't be supporting these people, but we understand in a Cold War context, you know, it's a direct military threat against the United States posed by Soviet nuclear weapons, so we understand the policy, but we're not going to ignore human rights. So the U.S. started writing human rights reports about every country in the world every year. And I happened to be there when we first started those reports, and I happened to actually draft the outline that's still used for those reports. Just asking simple questions about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, right to democratic elections, other basic human rights. Those started right when I was down the hall from Henry Kissinger. I was also there when we started negotiating something called the Law of the Sea Convention. It's become the Law of the Sea now, and it's something you may read about on occasion when you read articles about the South China Sea and about the islands off Japan, the Diaoyudao or Senkaku Islands. Why do I mention dogs and diplomacy at the State Department? Well, I learned this very soon. I noticed when I came in on Sundays in Washington that Secretary of State Kissinger was sometimes there. He would bring two large dogs with him. And I would see him and the dogs because his office is right down the corridor from mine. So one Sunday I thought, well, I can bring my dog in too. So I tried to do so with my dog on a leash, and the guard said, "Stay right there, Mr. Holbrook. You can't bring a dog into the State Department." And I said, "Well, Secretary Kissinger brings his dogs in. I see them all the time." And he said, "Rank has its privileges." So I had to go back home and leave my dog at home. Then I was here in Taichung for language training at the 美国大使馆华语学校, which is located at Zhonghua Lu. And I lived at a place called Cunzhongjie. And why do I have a water buffalo there? As Mark heard at AmCham, I used to ride my bicycle to school, and Taichung 35 years ago was a more rural place than it is now. And right in the middle of the city, there were rice paddies, and there was one near my house. And every morning I would ride past, and there'd be a water buffalo right there, about 10 yards from my bicycle. He was staring at me, and I would stare back at him. And I didn't attack him, so I hoped he wouldn't attack me. And he didn't. Then I went back to, I went to U.S. Embassy Taipei. There is no more U.S. Embassy in Taipei, but I was here when there was one, just as it began to close, working on economic development, trying to help American businessmen in Taiwan. Then I went back and I was assigned to the new U.S. Embassy in Beijing. But before I went there, China's new leader, who came into power in 1978 after going out of power 3 different times, finally got back in power, and promulgated the policy of reform and opening, 改革开放. And the result of that was he made an immediate visit to the United States. He established diplomatic relations with the United States, made a visit. There he is in Washington on the White House lawn. You know who that is, right? Jimmy Carter. And do you see me anywhere? You don't, but I was there. I was over here somewhere. Over here. There were hundreds of people watching the ceremony on the White House lawn. It's a typical thing in diplomacy. You have state visits, and you have a ceremony welcoming important guests, and this was the first one that I attended, welcoming Deng Xiaoping. Right after that, this is 2 months later, I went to Beijing, where we just opened our embassy there, worked for Ambassador Woodcock, and my assignment in those days was a very exciting assignment. There'd been no U.S. diplomats in China since 1949. So one of my important jobs was get out and travel. It sounds like a travel job. Go to as many provinces as you can in China, find out what's going on. This is sort of the essentials of what diplomats do, is find out what's going on in the country in which they're assigned. So I had the opportunity to visit lots of provincial capitals, talk to a lot of provincial officials, walked around the streets, talked to a lot of Chinese people, got invited into their houses because the policy had changed. I was told before I went, you'll never be invited inside a Chinese home. They're restricted so tightly, they're so fearful of foreigners, they'll never invite you. Well, that changed in an instant, and within a week of my arrival in Beijing, I was sort of officially invited. I was told by the people inviting me that the local party officials knew that I was there. But then I also learned that people on the street were happy to stop and talk with me all over China. So that was a 4-year assignment there. Another thing U.S. diplomats do, they become so-called control officers. I mean, actually, you're completely out of control. You're handling visits of very important people. In the U.S., that's members of the cabinet. Like when I was in Beijing, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare came for a visit. Joe Califano, I was in charge of his visit. Several members of Congress. Warren Burger, Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, came to China. I handled his visit. We went for a trip to Shanghai also. At one point he held up my little son and said he was the best behaved baby he'd ever seen. Someone took the picture and they never gave it to us. Still a little angry at the Chief Justice of the United States, the late Chief Justice. State Department sent me to Columbia University, got a degree there. I worked on the China desk. Since I drafted the initial outline for human rights reports, I also got to write human rights reports on China, both when I was in China and when I worked what we call the China desk in Washington. I was also there for the June 4th, 1989 incident. We had communications were not as advanced as now. We had open telephone lines to Beijing telling us what was going on as Chinese troops moved into Red Square, to Tiananmen rather. I worked in the legal advisor's office in Washington, and I worked on something called the INF Treaty with the Soviet Union for a year in Washington. Again, this is sort of typical kind of diversity in work and places and assignments. Then I came back to Shenyang. Shenyang anybody been to Shenyang? Anybody from Shenyang? Dongbei. Dongbei is what we used to call Manchuria. And among other things, I went to Russia. Have you been? Are you from Liaoning, Shanghai? Oh, you live there? Okay. Shenyang is a very dirty place. Used to be the capital of heavy industry in China under the Japanese. Still rather polluted today. Still, it was an interesting assignment. Got to travel all over. Manchuria is a huge area, about the size of the U.S. state of Texas. And I got to travel to Russia at one point. I crossed the Heilongjiang, the Black Dragon River, in the wintertime. There are no bridges across that river, so how did I cross? Well, there was an ice bridge. So I got in a Jeep. And a Jeep driven by Chinese officials drove us across the river. We met Russian officials who toasted me with many, many glasses of vodka every place I went. Every hour I had a different appointment, and a different set of officials would toast me with vodka. It's hard to say no when you've just met people. And then we drove back across the river. Fortunately, I was not driving myself. It was someone who didn't drink vodka. From there we went to Tokyo, the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, where the former U.S. Vice President was the ambassador. Again, the diversity of work. That I was soliciting the Japanese to donate money for worthy causes around the world, such as the Middle East peace process. I was back in Beijing for another assignment, 96, 99, and let's see, President Clinton came to visit. As I say, one of the advantages of being a diplomat is you get to meet all these important people, and you kind of make an assessment of what they're like. Deng Xiaoping is probably the one I met the most in terms of meetings, maybe 10 or 15 different meetings. But also President Carter, President Bush, and in this case President Clinton is visiting Beijing. And just as a sidelight, for U.S. presidential visits are huge affairs. They're planned months in advance. They send a pre-advanced team from Washington. And then they, a couple months later, send an advanced team from Washington. And then finally the president himself shows up. And before he gets there, something called the plane lands. It's not a typo, it's the plane. And another one called the car plane. What do you suppose those are? Well, the plane carries a presidential helicopter. Wherever the U.S. president goes, he usually takes a helicopter. So the plane is what the White House staff calls it, carries a helicopter. And also, the U.S. president takes his own car with him. Why does he do that? Well, partly for security reasons, because they know it's kind of bulletproof and has all these security features, and partly because it has all the controls for U.S. nuclear weapons and other weapons. If the U.S. should be attacked, while the president's having teriyaki in a Japanese restaurant in Tokyo, he can go to the car and order a response. So that's called the car plane. It's a plane that carries this huge presidential limousine. Wherever U.S. presidents go, I can tell you from experience, this is always a point of conflict. When the president goes to Beijing or the president goes to Tokyo, local officials will say, "Mr. President, don't you have confidence in our cars, our security? You're our guest. We'll take good care of you. You don't need to bring your own car." And of course the president is kind of indifferent, but the Secret Service, this is the part of their job. They'll say, "Well, yes, wonderful cars. You're absolutely right. We'll just do it this one time." And of course it's every time, actually. The president's only coming one time. So it's an argument that the U.S. usually wins, although I think at one point in Tokyo, President Clinton rode in a Japanese car from the Imperial Palace to the Akasaka Palace, which is the guest palace. It takes about 5 minutes. So he was willing to do that. Or the Secret Service was willing to let him do that. Also in Beijing, again, going back to your MUN issues, I was working on human rights questions about non-proliferation of dangerous weapons, trying to persuade the Chinese not to sell weapons to Iran or North Korea, dangerous weapons that is. IPR is intellectual property rights. It's on the economic side, trying to persuade the Chinese not to allow people to sell fake products in the streets. Again, diversity of assignments. We went back to New York City to a so-called think tank called the Council on Foreign Relations. Then to Manila, another visit by a U.S. president, President Bush. You also get to find out about local customs where you go, and perhaps some of the Filipino students here can tell us about chicken fighting, cockfighting in Manila. and in southern Philippines. I was the honored guest at such a place. It's like a bullfight arena, but only about a third of the size. And as the guest, I was brought into the ring. And I sat on a stool like that. And I was the only one. You know, everyone else was sitting around me. And the two chickens were fighting right in front of me. And at times the feathers came over to me. And I could see these long claws that they had, you know, they're really angry at each other. And I said to my host, well, what if they attack me? And the response was, that's why those two fellows are standing behind you. And I looked around, there were two guys behind me to protect me. So it's just a kind of experience you get as a diplomat, all kinds of things going on. Then finally, we got assigned to Paris, a great place. It's multilateral diplomacy. It's not as large as the United Nations, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. When I was there, it had 30 members. It was called the Rich Man's Club because it was the developed countries in Europe and the United States, all of which are not so rich now, actually, who were members. And so I was dealing constantly with representatives of all these different 30 countries. And before I saw your MUN materials, which covers most of this already, I set up a few things concerning how to deal with all these countries. They're sort of self-explanatory. Get your negotiating positions well set, know what the other countries' concerns are, anticipate their questions. This is the tricky one. Make concessions while preserving core interest. So you sort of have to figure that out in your own delegation. What kind of concessions are possible that don't really affect our core interest? And formal and informal sessions are equally important. That's absolutely true, and I see your materials also talk about lobbying sessions outside of the formal sessions. Those are really important. The formal sessions are important too, although I can tell you I tend to sleep at meetings myself. So I can't blame others who do the same. But outside of meetings, when people talk about going for coffee or tea or something, I'm very enthusiastic. And it turns out that those are perhaps more important sometimes than formal meetings because you're more casual and you can discuss things that perhaps are not your country's position, but just theoretically you can say, what if we thought about this? Or what if we tried to do it this way? Now, when you do that, if you're actually working for a government, you have to sort of put a footnote in saying, well, of course I'll have to get permission from Washington to actually do this, but suppose we did do it this way. And that's a sort of common feature of U.S. diplomacy. In MUN, it's a little more difficult because you're not reporting back to the Capitol, but maybe some of the people who are running the exercise can talk to you about that. But it's certainly important. Just about finished here. The U.S. Consulate had a nice assignment in 2007, asking people in Hong Kong how they liked things there 10 years after the handover to Beijing. Then became a professor in China for 5 years. Just some additional comments on your MUN. These are really excellent materials. And all these issues here, Syria, arms proliferation, women's rights, education, regulation of financial institutions, these are all hot issues in diplomacy today, all issues that it's perfectly appropriate for you to be engaging in MUN activities. As I mentioned, the importance of lobbying, can't emphasize that too much. Thanks very much, and happy to answer your questions. Oh, okay. Yeah. Sir.
So how do non-U.S. citizens become a U.S. diplomat?
The question is, how do non-U.S. citizens become a U.S. diplomat? In addition to being between 21 and 60, you have to be a U.S. citizen to be a U.S. diplomat. So non-U.S. citizens could not become diplomats. However, that's actually a very good question because the U.S. has perhaps 254 diplomatic posts around the world, embassies, consulates, other posts, and 80% of the people who work in those 254 posts are not Americans. You know, they're local citizens, so they don't become career diplomats, but they become part of the staff. For example, at the American Institute in Taiwan, we have a lot of Taiwan employees, more Taiwanese than Americans, and the same around the world. These are all local staff. They have interesting jobs. I mean, most of them are more expert in their countries than are the visiting American diplomats, because the Americans are only here for 3 years, and the local staff is here 10 or 20 or more years, and they've lived here all their lives. So actually, they're important parts of American diplomacy, even though they're not career American diplomats, but they could be career staff for an American mission overseas. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Are you allowed to become a U.S. diplomat if you are a U.S. citizen but you haven't lived in the States for very long?
Yeah, the only qualification, 21 to 60, U.S. citizen. You can live anywhere. And the test, the Foreign Service test, is also offered overseas at many of our diplomatic posts overseas.
In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned about how it's necessary to take a test in order to have a diplomatic position. I'm curious about what types of questions are on the test.
A lot of questions about U.S. history, about U.S. foreign policy, about foreign policies of other countries. Very broad-ranging test. Also, cultural questions, American culture, culture of other countries. You choose, I mentioned the 5 career tracks: political, economic, consular, administrative, public affairs. The test will have, part of the test will be for everyone to take. You sort of broad knowledge of history, policy, culture. And the other part of the test will be those who are in that particular track. There'll be sort of political questions, economic questions for those in the economic track. So it's a very broad test, and if you pass the written test, then in United States diplomacy, no one goes to libraries, no one does research. Everyone's always out talking to people. So there's an oral test after the written test. So you can do extremely well on a written test, but if you sort of can't talk to people, or people think, gee, what a strange person that is, perhaps you need to take the test again, or improve your oral skills.
What degree or major should we get in college in order to become a good diplomat?
Yeah, what degree or major in college to become a good diplomat? Again, nothing is required, but in order to both help you pass the test and to become a good diplomat, certainly a major like political science, history, English. It's important to know, you have to know 2 foreign languages to be as a U.S. diplomat, but the most important language is English, because you're always communicating with your own capital, you're always talking with American citizens overseas, anything you do right is going to be in English, not in a foreign language. So those 3, but again, any major will do, but I'd say history and political science majors probably would have a better chance, and English majors, of passing the test, the written test.
I'm kind of curious if there are any reasons why there's no longer an American embassy in Taiwan.
Why is there no longer an American embassy in Taiwan? Gee, I have no idea. No. As you recall, in 1949, the Kuomintang, the KMT government, finally lost the Civil War and came to Taiwan. And the People's Republic of China under the Communist Party won and was established in Beijing. Maybe for a couple of years, the government of Taiwan still hoped they could get back and sort of win the Civil War or restart it and come out ahead. But increasingly in the 1950s, it became clear, whether you liked the government in Beijing or not, it was clearly in control. So gradually other countries came to establish embassies in Beijing instead of Taiwan. The United States was one of the countries that did so last. We waited until 1979. By the time we established ties with Beijing, nearly all the rest of the world already had embassies there. When we did so, we told the government in Taiwan, well, why don't we have embassies in both places? Because neither Beijing nor Taipei has allowed that. Beijing has said, if you try to have it both ways, we won't let you. You can't establish an embassy in Beijing. And Taipei also said, if you try to have it both ways, we won't allow you to have an embassy in Taipei. So you had the no to China's viewpoint espoused by both governments. And finally the US decided, mostly for strategic reasons, because of, again, Cold War considerations. We had real fears about Soviet military might, and we saw the Chinese were moving away from the Soviet Union. And we thought, well, it no longer serves US interest to have an embassy in Taipei and have the government in Beijing angry at us when we see they're already angry with the Soviets. So for that reason, we established ties with Beijing, at the same time saying we're going to continue all of our unofficial relations with Taiwan. So currently today, I should have put the name of the American Institute in Taiwan there, 美国在台协会, and it's in Taipei. It looks like an embassy, it acts like an embassy, it's got the American flag, but we don't call it an embassy. It's a convenient fiction that most people are okay with, the government here is okay with. The staff there is about 3 times the size of the staff of the American Embassy in 1979, when I left in 1979.
But right now, I think each American Institute in Taiwan is there still an American?
Yes, yes.
But like I heard it got moved to
No, on the contrary, the question was, isn't there still some kind of American embassy that got moved underground? On the contrary, the American Institute in Taiwan has grown larger and larger, and now is getting ready to move into new quarters in a place called Neihu in Taipei, a big new embassy type compound. So it's it does everything embassies do, it just doesn't have an American ambassador. It does fly the American flag.
Describe the current relationship between the U.S. and China and all that.
The relations between U.S. and Taiwan and China? Yeah, well, the triangle. I'd say the triangle, well, first, usually when Beijing-Taiwan relations are good, then U.S.-Beijing relations are good. And when they're bad, U.S.-Beijing relations are bad. Currently, I'd say the relations between Beijing and Taipei are the best they've been since 1949. Because of all the trade and investment that's going on, because of all the visitors that are coming here now from the mainland. You have 600 flights a week coming from various cities in the mainland. It's good relations. Also, the U.S. and Taiwan have good relations. Just 3 or 4 months ago, the U.S. gave visa-free treatment to Taiwan citizens who want to go for travel or business reasons for up to 3 months. It's a privilege that was many years in the making, and now U.S. treats people in Taiwan better than on the mainland in that respect. Mainlanders still have to get a visa, trade and investment talks are scheduled to start in a couple of weeks between the U.S. and Taiwan. So there's good relations between U.S. and Taiwan. U.S. and China, it's always been sort of a tricky balance. On the economic side, on the cultural side, a huge relationship. 100,000 students from China currently in the United States, over 30,000 from Taiwan in the United States, by the way. On the other hand, on the political side, you have a suspicion by some in Beijing that the U.S. is trying to contain China, that we don't accept Chinese claims of sovereignty over certain islands in the South China Sea. There's also this sort of problem with regard to these Diaoyu Islands that Taiwan also claims, some political problems there. Overall, still good relations between U.S.-China, U.S.-Taiwan, China and Taiwan.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we only have time for one more question. Okay, just one more.
Currently, there are news reports about the People's Liberation Army hacking into American infrastructures in Shanghai. And what's the American doing about this situation, and how does this affect the Chinese-American relations?
Yeah, the question is about the People's Liberation Army hacking into American government and I think private company computers from some mysterious installation in Shanghai. I don't doubt it. I'm sure that's going to be the case. These are the people, it's the PLA in the Chinese government that thinks the U.S. is trying to contain China. So I'm sure that's happening. I'm sure also we're protesting diplomatically in Washington and in Beijing. And then finally, I'm sure the Chinese are denying it. But hopefully they'll stop doing it so obviously and maybe be more sneaky about it. I think my wife had a
Could I
comment.
have 2 minutes to speak about how? Could I
We
have
have
2
a-
minutes?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Please welcome my wife.
I know some of you like to be a diplomat, but some of you will end up to be a diplomat's spouse. Either you're a man or a woman, okay? So I'll quickly 2 minutes to explain to you how does diplomat's wife do when your husband has a job. Every 3 years have to move to another country. Okay, as a mother, when I move there, first thing I do is set up a home as comfort, as beautiful as however your children and your family will feel home. So they will feel they did not really leave the home before. And another thing is, when we go to the new school, I will become a volunteer parent in the school and try to show up in the school as many times as possible. So my children will feel proud that their parents are with them. So that's the sense of security that we can give to our children. Okay, I got 2 minutes. And also, because the job that my husband has contain a lot of security information within the State Department. So usually he comes home, he has zero business conversation with me. That's something you need to learn to adjust it and like it. Also, when you with State Department, every 3 years you transfer one country, they will give you the best packing company. They will pack everything for you. So this is really easy job for wife.